Aloha kako. My name's Brianna Govea. I'm the program specialist at the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center. On behalf of the center, mahalo for joining us tonight. While the remarks shared during this program don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the judiciary, I'd like to thank Chief Justice Mark Rechtenwald and the Hawaii State Judiciary and Legislature for their continued support of our mission. Our esteemed guest tonight is Jane Marshall Goodsill. Throughout Jane's career, as a licensed professional counselor, she listened to thousands of hours of personal stories. Upon retiring, she served for 10 years on her county's historical commission and refined the art of oral history collecting. In 2004, Jane's father passed, a prominent Honolulu corporate attorney, Marshall Goodsill. Out of desire to know more about her father's legal career and her passion for connecting with people, Jane began interviewing individuals connected to her father's legal work. They told Jane stories not only about her father, but of their own lives, how they got to Hawaii, and the passion they found in practicing law. From these unique conversations, her book, Voices of Hawaii, Life Stories from the Generation That Shaped the Aloha State, was born. Mahalo, Jane, for sharing some of these stories with us tonight. Before we get started, I just want to do some quick housekeeping. At the end of Jane's presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screens to submit questions or comments at any point during the program. You can also chat with Jane in the chat box. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Judiciary History Center's YouTube channel and website shortly. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jane.
Thank you, Brianna. That's a nice introduction. Hello, everybody. I think some of my special friends are there, and I wanted to give a shout out to anybody who supported me during this project and who is still supporting me by showing up for a talk like this. I guessed when I put this on that I would be talking to an audience that would be interested in legal issues. So I have arranged my talk around that. But I do want you to know I'm not a lawyer, just the daughter of a lawyer. In fact, when I was working, my world was to be a psychotherapist, completely different thing than law. And so I'm going to present material, some of it around an interview that was taken of my father before he passed away. And we don't know who took it, but it was a great, great interview. And we're so happy to have his voice. There's my papa. Some of the people who look at this love this picture because it actually shows his desk an organized mess. My father was very tidy. And when he left at the end of the day, everything put away and his desk was perfectly clean. But you can see he's in action working at the moment. So my father arrived in Honolulu in 1941. And he became a member of the bar, and his bar number is 210. Many people, lawyers in particular, like to know what number people were. So Papa was 210. He says, at the time I came to Hawaii in 1941, most of the legal work was done locally in Hawaii. Communication with the mainland was too slow and cumbersome. This was a good thing for a young lawyer because we had to accumulate a broad base of legal knowledge instead of specializing. As a consequence of that, my father had a fascinating career because he got to do all kinds of law, corporate law, which interested him. So he said, my career was very interesting because of this. He goes on to say, one of my senior partners, Livingston Jenks, got to Hawaii because the 1933 Securities Act was passed after the Great Depression. It required companies to have certain kinds of trust mortgages. It also prohibited companies from having interlocking directors. The trust mortgages in Hawaii had to be extensively revised to conform to the new Securities and Exchange laws, which created a great deal of work for corporate lawyers. And one of the things I said I would talk about in this talk was this, the reason why many lawyers moved to Hawaii probably was to do some of that work around the SEC changing its laws after the Great Depression and the recession. And so I thought that was an interesting thing that I had never thought of before. Then related to interlocking directors, Judge Frank Paget said, In Hawaii, the business community paid absolutely no attention to the idea that you should diversify. For instance, Atherton Richards was a trustee of the Bishop Estate, and his brother-in-law, Frank Midkiff, was a trustee of the Bishop Estate. This was very prevalent in Hawaii. You couldn't turn around, but you saw interlocking relationships. And what I did for my book is I took interviews of many, many different people. So these quotes that I'm giving are interviews from people that I interviewed, except for my father. That was a gift that we found his interview. But when Walter Dodd starts talking about interlocking directories in here, it's very funny. I'm not going to read that to you, but many of the stories that I'll refer to are in the book. So next thing I wanted to do was give you a glimpse of the kind of work, no, I'm still on my father, the kind of work that my father was doing when he first came to Hawaii. He was, as a young lawyer, he was doing merger of sugar companies, a kind of work that does not even exist today because there are no sugar companies anymore. He also did complex corporate reorganizations as a result of the 33 and 35 Acts for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He also revised trust mortgages of the two utility companies as a consequence of the 1935 Act. He said it was interesting but painstaking work. So you can see already he's doing many different kinds of work. And then he got involved with the liquidation of the Hawaii Consolidated Railroad on the Hamakua coast after the 1946 tsunami. He said, this is a quote, "A lot of land issues arose. Who actually owned the land this railroad was on? A lot of it was a railroad purpose grant. I spent a long time, and Hawaiian Trust very properly was very nervous about its responsibilities as trustee. I spent hours with their executives. The board of directors of the railroad company were most of Hawaii's leading businessmen. The chairman of Alexander and Baldwin, the head of AmFac, the head of Brewer, Mr. Von Holt, the head of Davies, were all on the board of directors. As a young man, it was a great business experience to work with all these men. And you can imagine it might have been. And I'm not, he didn't say this, but I will speculate that he proved his worth or his intelligence in some kind, because he got ongoing work, and his firm did, from many of these business entities throughout his career. Another thing I talk about in what I did was I collected all the stories from people, and I got the very best stories that people told. I think Alice Guild is listening tonight. So I interviewed Alice for a couple of hours, and I got the very best stories and put them in the book. I got a very funny story. It's called Voices of Laughter. My chapter headings are all, the first one is Voices of My Father's Generation, Voices of the Old Days, Voices of World War II, Voices in a Racial Melting Pot, and so on. And one of them is called Voices of Laughter. And there's my father's story about closing down the Oahu Railroad is in that chapter. So I'm not going to tell you details about it, but that is some of the legal work that he did. And then finally, here's something I thought was very interesting. He worked for Dole. He said, "I had a case which sounds simple, but it wasn't. The pineapple company began to produce pineapple juice and froze it in little cans. There was a higher income tax rate for canned products than for other products. The state claimed these were canned products because they were in a can. We claimed they were not canned products. That canning means heating and pasteurizing." Who knew? I just thought it was so interesting to see the kind of work he did. So those are the things that I have to say about my father. And I did want to say that the Q&A is open. If anybody has any questions they want to ask, I will check it every now and again. And I will answer them if I can. The other thing is I have a lot to talk about tonight, and I may or may not get to it, but I started with our elders. I started with the oldest people on the list because they're history, and I'm trying to do a historical presentation. So the next person, there we go, is Chief Justice Ronald Moon. Isn't that a great picture of him? He was so kind. I called him and asked if he would do an interview, and he said, sure. And we set up a time, and he came to my apartment. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. And so at some point he talked about civility in the law, which was one of the topics I wanted to cover tonight. So I was going to read what he said. Attorneys have attacked each other and been uncivil in their behavior over the years. When I got into the judiciary, Chief Justice Herman Lum assigned me to projects that focused on the demeanor of attorneys in court. Lawyers are not supposed to be soldiers who fight to the death. They are supposed to be gentlemen and gentlewomen and try to make peace with each other. In the 1980s, the courts began adopting rules that were based on civility. They were supposed to communicate with lawyers were supposed to communicate with one another instead of stonewalling. They could not keep secrets anymore. No such thing as trial by ambush. Courts throughout the nation have adopted these rules to make things less contentious. Since my retirement, as I talk to trial judges, they tell me that it's back to where it was so many years ago. Attorneys are becoming more contentious and becoming more personal in their attacks. No lawyer should encourage this kind of behavior. It slows down the courts and creates more cost to the parties involved. So that touches on another issue that I have in my agenda, which is the slow working of the judiciary. This is part of the reason why the contentiousness makes the court cases go longer than they might otherwise go. And the other part is in my book when Chief Justice Moon talks about how people don't show up on time and so on. So I'll leave that for you to read in the book in case you should want to. And the book, by the way, is available at all the local bookstores, and I encourage people to go and buy locally. And if you cannot do that, it is available on Amazon, but I didn't say it. Okay. The next thing I wanted to talk about was David Fairbanks, who became a partner in my father's firm, but he started out at the same time I did. I was working as a receptionist there from the time I was about 13 or 14. I don't know when I could start working, but maybe. And David was the young attorney, most handsome man I'd ever seen, and very personable, as you know, if you know David. So I asked David when I did my interview with him 50 years later, right? Do you have any reflections on how the law has changed since the time you started practicing? And he said, the law hasn't changed much, but the practice has changed considerably. It is less civil. There is more competition for work. A lawyer is supposed to solve problems, not make things worse. You hear the young lawyers talking about my case. It isn't their case, it's the client's case. You do what is right for your clients. I don't think too many young lawyers today look at it that way. There's a lot of self-aggrandizement. There is more of what I would call sharp practice, which you didn't have in Hawaii back then because this was a small place. If you treated somebody shabbily, and don't you love that word? A word that's not used commonly in modern lexicon. If you treated somebody shabbily, the next time you worked with them, you'd get it back doubly. Now that code of civility doesn't seem to matter so much, except among the older lawyers. There seems to be more aggressiveness and less civility, which is not good. I think that the advent of computers, online resources, and email also contributed to that. You see stuff in emails that is scathing and acrimonious, almost personal attacks. But people can get away with it because they aren't speaking face to face. Many lawyers have lost the give and take of talking across the table. In my day, there would be an adversary who'd say, come over and look at my files. And you'd reply, come over and look at my file. Here's what I've got. And quite often you could resolve the case. Sweet story. Okay, Brianna, let's go to the next one. I was recommended that I needed to talk to Frank Paget. So I call him up, and he has a big reputation, and he's a forceful man. And from his reputation, I was intimidated. But I showed up, and somehow or another, I hit the sweet spot with him. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. W. Barton Leach, author of The Rules Against Perpetuities, was a Harvard professor of Frank Paget. So Paget was intimidating to me, but I hit the sweet spot when I began our interview mentioning that Leach was also my father's professor. And I said, what did you learn from him? Oh my gosh, he went on, and it was so fascinating. He educated me all about trust law, and Hawaii is a very interesting place to be practicing trust law because the ali'i had trusts, and philanthropic agencies have trust, and personal trusts. So it was a very interesting place, and he got a referral to go to Hawaii and practice law through Professor Leach. And he said he was the reason I came to Hawaii to practice law. So he just became animated, and it was a really fun interview. This is another story he told me on a slightly different topic. After law school graduation, I missed the deadline for taking the bar in Hawaii. So I had to wait a year. He almost missed it by a day or something like that. I took the exam in 1948 and passed. That day, my senior law partner, Garner Anthony, came to me and said, tomorrow I've got this case in federal court where the alien property custodian is confiscating a Shinto shrine. You take it, Frank. Frank said, I was a Japanese prisoner of war for 9 months during World War II. And here I was representing a Shinto shrine against the American government. It was a hell of a way to start your law practice, the first day after you passed the bar. And I asked him, how did you do that without bias? Because you must have had some hard feelings against the Japanese. He said, that was that, this was now, this was law, this was business. I was representing my client. So I thought that was an interesting case. Let me check. Oh, no more questions. Okay. So I'm going to go on as though I'm very fascinating. And if I'm not, you need to tell me. This, I love this picture. Here's Jim Case back when and now. So in 2018, purely by coincidence, because I read in the journal that he had written this book, I got it. It's not the type of book I usually read. I hadn't started this project. And it was called Hawaii Lawyer, Lessons in Law and Life from a 6-Decade Career. I read every word of it and found it fascinating. And from it, I got a glimpse of what a practicing corporate lawyer in Hawaii did. Sad to say that even though I was the daughter of a practicing corporate lawyer, I had no idea what Papa did at work. It's not the kind of thing that fathers usually talk to their daughters about, or sons, I might add. And just as a cautionary tale, I will say, when I began to learn what my father did, my love and appreciation for him grew exponentially. I had always been told that my father was brilliant and he was this and he was that, but how did I know it until I began to find out what he did and how it helped our community? And so I was very grateful to Jim Case for spelling out what a corporate lawyer did. And then I began my research and I said, I wish Papa had written a book, but since he didn't, I know a lot of people who still know him, and I can start by interviewing them. And I think one of the people in the audience today is the man who is managing the Goodsill firm at the moment, Mike O'Malley. Hey, Mike. And he's one of the people I interviewed, and many of the other lawyers, and they told me about my father, about law back in the day. And from that began this interest in taking these interviews, which allowed me to collect stories which were too precious to keep to myself, hence writing the book. It is not a book all about lawyers, because even though I could have shared all this that I'm sharing with you, my publisher said, you can't have it be the Marshall Goodsill show. And I said, okay. So I interviewed many people other than the lawyers, but the lawyers is what I'm talking about tonight. Okay, so this is another quote from Jim Case. He said, the most impact I had on Hawaiian land ownership in my law career was the fee conversion work I did. Fee conversion broke up the system so people could own their own land and not be subservient to some rich landowner. It was a second major revolution in Hawaii land ownership after the Great Mahele. Now, you can agree whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. That would be your call, but I just thought it was an interesting comment, so I'm including it. So, Brianna, we can go on to the next. And I'm still seeing there are no questions. Okay, I love these two. Here is Willie Moore and his wife, Sally. And I can't remember how I know, one of my high school classmates said, you need to talk to Willie Moore. So I did, and it was fascinating because when I was growing up, I was just playing tennis and, studying and playing and whatever I was doing. I had no idea there was even such a thing as aviation law, or that there would be such a thing as the rusting of the Aloha Stadium. Good story in my book about that, told to me by Willie Moore. And also he was the lawyer for the harbor, Honolulu Harbor. Who knew there was such a thing? So he told me many stories, and many of them are in the book. So I'm not going to repeat his stories, but I am going to do an aloha to him because he was very educational to me. And one night I'm having dinner with Sally and Willie, and in walks Raymond Tam, who I don't know. And he says, you need to interview that guy. Well, when people tell me to interview somebody, I say, okay. I say, will you introduce me? So we walked over to the table, and this is Jane Goodsill. Will you let her interview? And Raymond goes, okay. So we set it up. And a couple of days later, I'm over there taking an interview with him. And the first thing he does is he puts down a book. He says, this is a book I wrote about my uncle, Clarence Ching. Oh, okay, interesting. And he says, this is another book I wrote. It's about me. I went, oh, okay. He said, so I've written everything in 2 books. What else do you want to know? And I, deer in the headlight, I went, well, I don't know. Do you think it's worth your time to talk to me if you've already written it down? He said, okay. So we started talking, and it was fascinating. And I have quite a long quote that I'm going to put from him. And there are other parts of him that show up in my book. So if you're interested, you can go and read more. But here he says, passing the bar exam on my first attempt in 1958, my family was very proud of me. I received my law license from the Supreme Court Territory of Hawaii. And I should have his number, his 3-digit number, but I don't. In 1960, having completed my military tour of duty, I arranged to have a meeting with claims manager Tom Roth at Fireman's Fund. I was dressed in a coat and tie, and Tom and I hugged each other and shook hands. It was such a happy moment to renew my acquaintance with an old friend who he had worked for several summers. After some small talk, I told Tom that I was now back home for good, that I had acquired a lot of trial experience as a U.S. Air Force judge advocate, and that I was ready to try cases for Fireman's Fund. Let me try some cases for Fireman's Fund, I said. Anything, the worst cases that you have, the kind that nobody wants. The $50 subrogation case. Let me show you what I can do. Tom replied, Ray, I really like you, and you worked well, and you did a great job for us, but I'm really sorry. We have a policy at AMFAC that we only hire lawyers from Robertson Castle or Anthony Smith Wild, Beatty, and Cades, or Anderson, Wren, and Jenks. I'd love to use your service, but policy is policy. I was shocked, stunned, blindsided, crushed. The firms he mentioned were all haole firms, all Caucasian, no Asians, no Hawaiians, no Polynesians, no Blacks, no Hispanics, only whites. I left angry and very disillusioned. I applied at 4 other insurance companies. Same answer, same result. At that time, Hawaii was being touted by the Hawaii Tourist Bureau as the melting pot of the Pacific, the land of aloha. Yet here I was, a local boy who could not get a job because of professional racial discrimination. I made a silent resolution. If they wouldn't have me, I'd go to the other side. I was ready to shake down the thunder from the sky, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Today, when I reminisce about my career, I thank the good Lord that I was rejected by Fireman's Fund and all the other 4 insurance companies. I wound up spending my entire career representing insured plaintiffs against insurance companies and loving it. So that was his experience. And I will also say that when Willie introduced me to Raymond, he said, this guy's got a lot of my money in his pocket because he's such a good lawyer. He won so many cases. And I just love that. So you can see what a joy it's been for me to meet these people and get to know them. Okay, Brianna, let's go on to Randy Roth. Randy was another person I was intimidated because I had read his book, Broken Trust. And I thought, but the reason I insisted on getting a connection with Randy and asking him if he would be the interview is I had a story in my mind that something about the Broken Trust essay had to do with a dinner party that happened at my family's home. And in the book, I talk about around the dining room table because it was a significant place for our family formation. I think it's the reason what I learned at that dining room table from my mother and from her social skills is why I can do this presentation and why I can interview people and connect with them in a way that they will tell me things that are intimate and trust me with their intimacies. And then, of course, once I collect all that data, I write up what I think I'll use in the book and send it to them and say, did I get it right? So they have an opportunity to know what's in it before it gets published. So everybody is okay with what's gone in the book, which is a blessing. And so I asked Randy about the dining room table, and this is the story he told. My wife, Susie, and I attended a dinner party at the Goodsill home in May of 1997. I had become convinced it was just a matter of time before the IRS would revoke Bishop Estate's tax exemption because of trustee misconduct. I also believed the selection of Bishop Estate trustees by the state's Supreme Court justices was corrupting judicial selection. The guests at the Goodsill dinner party discussed these concerns. Toward the end of the dinner conversation, Herb Cornell suggested that Oz Stender might be willing to share his specific concerns about the other trustees. The involvement of your father encouraged me to publish the Broken Trust essay. It was as though I enjoyed a halo effect by gaining their trust at the Goodsill table. I find that very moving. And whether you agree with how Randall handled things or not, he did bring some things to light that needed to be looked at. And he said that he couldn't have done it without Oz Stender, and he couldn't have done it without Judge King and other people who supported him. But he said this is where it began at our dining room table. That's kind of moving. All right, Brianna is moving me along. It's okay, Brianna. These fine gentlemen were some of the first, Ron Law, Mitch Dolier were some of the first two that got hired at my father's firm in what I call the younger generation. And so I will start with Ron Lum. I'm not going to quote anything from him, but there is a wonderful story about him in the book. And he said he got he went to interview with, I guess the firm was called Anderson, Wren and Jenks at the time, and the senior partners were Robbins Anderson, Ted Jenks, and Heaton Wren. And Ted Jenks and Heaton Wren were out of town, so Marshall Goodsill and Martin Anderson interviewed Ron Lum. And he says that's why he thinks he got hired. He doesn't think he would have gotten hired, the first Asian, in 1967 had the older generation been doing the interviewing, which is interesting. Mitch Dolier started with the firm in around 1971. And Mitch told me some beautiful stories, many of which are in the book. So I'm not going to read them out loud, but I have a big shout out to him because he gave me a lot of information and some very warm stories about my family. Mitch and I are talking, and we talk for, an hour and a half. And at the end of it, he says, I just have one thing I want to say to end. And I said, what's that? He said, I loved your father too. We both started crying. So now I'm going to move to Tom Williams. Tom says, most people became lawyers because they didn't like math. I showed an aptitude for it. It was like a second language for me. In Public Utility Commission, otherwise known as PUC, in Public Utility Commission work, there are a lot of mathematical formulas and calculations. It helps if you are able to understand the data that is put into the computer in order to determine if the outputs make sense. He told me sometimes you'd be going over the data and you'd realize that the result was not right. But if you couldn't go back formulaically and figure out where the error was, you couldn't prove your point and you couldn't get a good rate hearing. The details wouldn't be right. And so he goes on to say, later in my career, I would talk to an associate because they were trying to find other people who would do public utility law. I would talk to an associate to assess if they might be interested in this kind of work. I'd say, where does electricity come from? If they looked over at the wall outlet, I would know they didn't have any concept of how electricity was generated, transmitted, or distributed. I put that in voices of laughter because I thought that was a very funny story. And I see there's a question. Oh, it's my friend Zita. She's telling me she loves the stories about how the interviews came about. Need to reread the book to reconnect with your subjects. Oh, thank you, Zita. People have told me that. I ask them sometimes, is this book going to stay fresh? Or is this book going to, age with time? And they say, no, we think it's going to stay fresh because the stories are just interesting and don't seem to get old. So I'm grateful. And if Zita is interested in rereading it, that's a good sign. Zita is one of the people I interviewed and works at the Iolani Palace. She's the historian there. All right, so now I'm going to move on to Bill Tam and John Rappoon. Bill, I think Bill is in our audience tonight. I think he signed up. And Bill was very educational to me. I have just a little bit here about what he said, but there's a lot in the book because my friend John Rappoon, who I went to high school with, challenged the Board of Water Supply way back when that if you're going to grow taro, you need to have water not diverted from this valley to another valley because you want it somewhere else. The water needs to stay in the valley where it was born, as it were. And he got Bill Tam involved. And all these issues are very complicated. So please forgive me if I don't represent you perfectly as I'm saying this, Bill. When I submitted my interview for Bill to review, he was very particular and he got all the words right. And I'm very grateful because otherwise, how could I have got it done right? So here's what Bill Tam said, just a brief thing to give you some background information on the water rights issue and to give you some humor to it too. Ancient Hawaiian practices diverted surface water from the streams to the taro patches, which held the water, releasing it later into the oceans, where it nourished the reefs and fed the fish. Hawaiians shared water based upon 1, need, and 2, did you do your share of the labor? The job of the konohiki was to sort out sharing arrangements. Maybe you get some water in the morning and you get some in the afternoon. You didn't do your labor, so you're going to get a little bit less today. This area has a lot of trees and it's cool, so you don't need as much water to keep the taro patch cool. Parenthetically, to grow taro, you have to keep water below 76 degrees, otherwise you get taro rot. End parentheses. This area in the midday sun is in the midday sun, so you need more water to keep it cool. So you can kind of see how the ancient Hawaiian practice worked, and then you can read the book to find out more about the lawsuit. And to give you just a snapshot of my friend and poet John Rappoon, I'm going to tell you this story. One day I asked Dr. Mitchell, who was a beloved person in the Hawaiian community, worked at Kamehameha, if he knew the taro farmer, old man Nakata, Bob's father. No, he said, but I'd like to. So we marched out to Nakata's la'oi to find him there with his shovel. His shovel blade handle is always wet. He uses it like a fulcrum to pry out taro. So the handle has a beautiful bend to it because he's always leaning on it, you see? Dr. Mitchell pulls up his pants legs, goes into the la'oi, shakes hands with Nakata, and starts speaking to him in Hawaiian. Here is this haole historian talking to an Okinawan farmer in Hawaiian. I literally saw the lo'i become a place where cultures could intersect. I love that story. So let's go on to Ray Okata. Thank you. Here's Ray. He's an attorney in the Goodsill firm. And I might say, just historically speaking, that it has had many names, but when my father joined, it was called Goodsill and, Anderson, Wren, and Jenks. When those men retired, I think there was a law that said, I'm not sure about this, Mike O'Malley should correct me if I'm wrong, you need to have the names of live partners in the name of your law firm. So they changed the firm to Goodsill, Anderson, Quinn, and Stifel. And then there came a point in time when that law was no longer accurate and you could have a deceased partner's name in the firm. So after my father died and they were doing some rebranding of the firm, they decided they would pick one name, and the one name they picked was Goodsill. So now it's Goodsill, Anderson, Quinn, and Stifel, but known as the Goodsill firm. And I'm very, very proud of that. I walked in to that office one day and they gave me a coaster, and the coaster said, Goodsill. And I thought, oh, I think I better have one of those. They said, oh, yes, you better have one of those. So we're very proud that the name is thus used. And I will say, I think it helped open some doors when I was trying to get people to agree to have interviews with me. Hold on, I'm looking at the time. We're doing good. Okay, so this is about Ray Okata. 2 stories about Ray. When we'd see Ruth, my mother, Ruth Goodsill, at firm events, she was like the Queen of England. And you had to be on your best behavior. When your father asked me to help with his estate, I was a bit apprehensive. At our first meeting after Marshall died, Ruth said, now that you're my lawyer, I think you ought to know dirty laundry. Marshall had a mistress. Ray, the expression on his face, you can imagine. He said, many of the other partners in the firm had the same mistress. The law. They were all workaholics because they loved the law so much. It took all their energy away from everything else. I had to laugh at that because I get the same line at home. The law is an unforgiving mistress, she said. And then she said, well, if you can laugh at that, I guess we can get along. And I thought, wow, the Queen of England has a sense of humor. And we did very nice work with Ray, and it was a joy to have him be part of our team. He talked about his family coming out of the internment camps after World War II. They lived in Fresno, California. When they came out of the internment camps after the war, there was this big push to be Americanized. That's why the children in my generation have English middle names. After the war, the whole family moved back to Fresno, California because they couldn't get jobs anywhere else. Before the war, they were renting their farms because Asians couldn't own land. If you were not European heritage, you could not own land. When their children were born, they put the land into the names of their children because their children were citizens, having been born in the US. Most property was put in the names of the oldest son, who continued farming. This practice, of course, resulted in a lot of family disputes about the fairness of their inheritances. And I turned to Ray and I said, given your exposures to this issue when you were growing up, Ray, it comes as no surprise that you ended up an estate and trust lawyer. And he looked at me and said, I never thought of that. To me, it seemed undeniable. So that's our friend Ray. All right, let me see if there are any more questions. No more questions. Okay, Brianna, let's go on to the next. This is Jeff Watanabe. When I interviewed Duncan McNaughton, who was one of the first people I interviewed because I knew he would be safe, he was a family friend, and I could just go knock on the door and say, Duncan, can I talk? Oh, we had fun. We were just laughing about the stories. And afterwards, I had a really nice dinner at their house, and his wife, Dawn, said, you need to interview Jeff Watanabe. I said, okay, will you make an introduction? So she did. A couple days later, I met with Jeff, who was very educational to me. Sorry, I'm looking around. Yeah, very educational to me because he gave me a perspective on many things that I didn't have. And it's beautifully encapsulated in the book. Go to the index, look at Watanabe, and call up the things he said. But I'm going to do 2 short paragraphs. Maui was the only island other than Oahu and Niihau that was directly affected by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor Day. An offshore submarine shelled Kahului. Ordinary Japanese and Japanese Americans were not immediately affected by the war, but about 1,000 to 2,000 Japanese community leaders, teachers, clergy, and so forth were interned on Oahu at a relocation camp. Many were later transferred to mainland camps. Hawaii's Japanese population made up 20 to 25% of the total population. And that was a significant labor force, especially on our plantations, which he went on to speculate is why only the leaders got sent to the internment camps, but the people that were working needed to stay so they could keep the economy running. So that's part of his story. And then he goes on to say, my generation was culturally handicapped by the outbreak of World War II. The Nisei generation went to Japanese language school, so they spoke Japanese. Once the war started, Japanese teachers were targets for internment, so their schools closed. This resulted in a greater cultural distance between generations, especially with the sensei, to which I belong, whose Japanese language skills were lacking. It became difficult for my generation to find out what really happened from the often more closed-mouthed Nisei and Issei. Interesting cultural comment because it tells us that the transfer of information intergenerationally was affected by their experiences in the war and their unwillingness to talk about it. And that was one of the things that came up over and over again as I did this book, is I learned points where culture had easily been communicated and places where it had been stilted. In the Hawaiian community, there are many stories about wasn't popular to be Hawaiian, and therefore people stopped doing their practices, and many people spoke openly about it. And people also spoke very openly to me. I was very interested in the fact that people spoke so openly about racial discrimination. And there's a chapter in the book, in fact, I'm going to read you the subchapters from the chapter called Voices in a Racial Melting Pot. The first one is segregated neighborhoods, which includes comments from Jane Goodsill and Lois Taylor Clark, Dean Sakamoto, Jeff Watanabe, Ron Moon, Curtis Tyler, Kenneth Mokuakani, Bob Liliestrand, and Stuart Ho. The next subsection is integrated boardrooms, which includes interviews with Henry Clark, Mark Fukunaga, Wilson Moore, and Raymond Tam. The next one is integrated social clubs, where I got information from Bill Smith, the Olympic swimmer's son, Riley Smith, who's part of my posse, and Jerry and Philip Ching and Stuart Ho. And the final section is glass ceilings, where I talked to Raymond Tam, Stuart Ho, Ron Lum, and Jeff Watanabe. So a lot of information to be gained if you're interested in it. And Brianna, let's go to the last slide. On the left is my friend Moses Haya, who is an attorney for the he was the executive director of the Native Hawaiian Legal Foundation, if I got the name right. So Moses was telling me his story, which is covered well in the book. He tells a beautiful story. And I was noticing it must be hard for him at times. And this little summation explained to me why it was hard. He said, there's an argument that some Hawaiians are making that I totally disagree with. There are a number of Hawaiians who are arguing that land in Hawaii remains held by Hawaiians, and that anyone claiming interest in the land does not have any interest in the land unless they can show they are a direct descendant of the original owner. Then there's a lot more to that, which is in the book. He said, in this case, I come from a legal frame of reference and they come from emotion. I said, having them be your people and your lineage, it must be hard for you to walk that line. And he sighed and he said, it is, which I thought was a very interesting commentary. And the final person I want to talk about is Calvin Takeda. He's in the book quite a bit. He talks about internment camps and his family's experiences with them. He also talks about being executive director for the Nature Conservancy and for the Hawaii Community Foundation, which happened later in his career. He started out as a lawyer, but didn't particularly like practicing law and found a really nice niche for himself. Excuse me, let's get some water. So these two are showing up at the last slides that I'm going to present because they're the youngest. These guys are younger than me. And I tried very hard to interview the people in the higher generation, because they might not be with us that much longer. And sadly, Sam Cooke is not. And I did get a very great interview with Mary. And Calvin, it was very interesting talking to Calvin. He tells a lot about what happened in the organizations that he ran. And it was so much fun for me because I knew Calvin in high school. And if you'd asked me whether he was going to turn into Big Smoke, I wouldn't have bet on it. And what he's become and what he's accomplished is so admirable. And I think he's done it just with personality and brain and logistics. It's been delightful to have gotten to know Calvin. So if you want to know more about him and his story, it's also in the book. And that is the end of my talk. I thought I would never finish it, and I've finished it in 45 minutes. So Brianna, where should we go from here? Should we ask questions? Or what
Yes,
should we do?
mahalo, Jane, mahalo. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that richness in our legal community. I mean, the passions, the individual passions of everyone you interviewed, and their careers. I mean, it's so much, and it's your book. I think is a gift. So much of the legal history in our position at the Judiciary History Center, we understand too that recording this is so important, and it often takes personal efforts to make sure that this is carried on for future generations, that these stories are remembered. So I just want to say thank you. This was,
Thank you. And
yeah, a really great presentation.
There's something I wanted to say about that. Every interview that I took is 20 or 30 pages of transcripts, written transcripts that the person has approved. And I couldn't put all that data in the book. I just had to pick and choose the best stories. But someday I will turn those archives over to some agency that is yet to be named, who can help store them and have them available for research and historians in the future. So all these stories, because each one of these people that I've talked about gives their life story from beginning to end and all the things that happened in between. And I'm just doing little harvesting, but it's all there. So it's really quite a treasure trove.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jane. I do have some questions.
Great.
Let's see, how much time do we have? We have about 10 minutes. So I'm on a more of a personal side. You mentioned how you did work in your father's office when you were younger, but there wasn't much communication about the inner workings. And I'm interested if, despite that, if you still feel that your dad's legal career had an impact in your career with counseling. I mean, they're both very person to person oriented, helping fields.
Can you believe I've never thought of that? But I have thought about one thing. When people describe my father and the way his brain worked, one of the things they said is he could take very complex legal issues and bring them into focus and explain them so even the layperson could understand them. And that is something that I can do. As a therapist, you need to be able to hear people going all over the place and saying everything. And you can keep track of all the storylines and come down and say, okay, how about this? And they go, that's it. So that is a skill that I tend to think my mother taught me more about how to be a therapist because of the interpersonal communication skills. But I think as you ask it, I'm going to give a tip of my hat to my father as well. Great.
I love that. Love that. Thank you. And you spoke a lot about the organic, kind of spontaneous nature to some of these interviews, but I'm curious, and the impact of your mom and how she's helped you be a great speaker and communicator. But I'm curious what you would say your secret might be to taking these oral histories, and what advice you would give to someone who's feeling inspired to take on their own projects.
What a great question. I do have a secret. I do have a secret, just like my father had a secret mistress. My secret is curiosity. Curiosity. I go into each interview with a completely open heart. Just whatever you want to tell me, I want to hear. And people will, I do the Columbo thing. I talk about this in a lot of my interviews where people will say the most common knowledge things. And I'll go, no kidding. Tell me more about that. But it's partly to get them talking, but it's partly just sheer curiosity. This is a great story. And it's so interesting, Brianna. People will be telling their life story, and some people will just hit on this date happened and this date, and I slow them down. I go, no. Tell me what the grandfather looked like. Tell me how he walked. Tell me what he meant to you. Tell me where you fished. And then they would begin to get in the rhythm. And then their story would begin to get more personal. And each time I'm taking an interview, I can tell the moment when something is happening that will end. Now I can, that will end up in the book. I can tell because there's just a silence that comes around my spirit from hearing something very profound. And I have worked on the basis, if it's interesting to me, it will be interesting to my audience. And doggone if that hasn't worked out. In the beginning, I thought every one of these stories, everybody knows all these stories, but it turns out they don't. So curiosity.
And what does this project mean to you?
Well, okay, if you can imagine that for the first book, I interviewed 75 people. So if you can imagine your life being exponentially opened up by exposure to 75 brilliant, heartfelt movers and shakers in our community. And because I've spent time caring about them, listening to their stories, and I would venture to say, whereas I loved hearing what they had to say, they loved having somebody hear them say it. So at the end of that, you're like this. If I need to ask somebody something, I can ask any one of them. If I need something from Mike O'Malley, Alice Guild, Bill Tam, Ray Okada, any of them, they're all family friends and so on, but even people who I never knew before, Jeff Watanabe, I'm sure he would be able to open his intellect and say, yes, I think I can help you solve that problem, Jane. So what has this meant to me? Oh, just an opening of my whole world. And to feel as if I'm doing a service to my community by preserving treasured stories and presenting history in a way that's easy to access for anybody. These are easy stories to read and fun. And some of them are serious, but they give you a good feeling, the wind beneath your wings kind of a feeling. And one other thing I wanted to say is I got the go-ahead last week to do Voices of Hawaii Volume 2.
That was my next question.
Was it your next question? Volume 2, it's coming up. And the publisher is in on the program, and I've already done 30 interviews, and I'm going to the Big Island in October and November, and I'm going to do 30 more. And then I'm going to come home and compile them all, and the book will be out next Christmas. Not this Christmas, next Christmas.
That's so exciting, and best of luck with that. I know it's going to be such a fun process getting more of these stories. And I just want to say, it's what you've done, the courage to reach out to sometimes strangers and people who you were so intimidated by or awe-inspired by. It's such a good lesson for us to not be afraid to connect. So much of our world today is, just fractured, it's insular. We're so afraid just to speak to people on the other side, or
well, now that's a very good point. And by the way, thank you for that compliment, because it takes a lot of courage to do this. It not only takes a lot of discipline to do the behind the scenes archiving and transcribing and writing, but the personal connection, oh my goodness. You think I want to call Frank Paget? No, that was scary. And not even, but I forgot where I was going. I was thanking you for the compliment. Thank you.
Well, and just to follow up, your professional career as a counselor too, that's so heavy to listen to people, and you've continued this now as a passion in the authorship work you're doing, and that's a lot. And I just want to say thank you for taking that on and listening and recording people's lives for the future. So,
I could say that it is my pleasure. I don't know who comes away more enriched after I have an interchange with people, whether it would be me or whether it would be them. I know that each person that's given an interview, one guy said, I haven't thought of those things for 50 years. And now that they're recorded, I don't have to think about them anymore. They're all in a safe place. If we ever need them, there they are. And when I die, they'll be available to everybody. Wonderful.
That's so funny. Well, thank you so much, Jane. And we are getting at time. I do want to share with our audience that we have some some other upcoming programs at the History Center, and I'm hoping Jane will be able to collaborate with us again in the future. Let me just pull up my screen.
Brianna, while you're doing that,
yes.
while you're doing that, I'll say that because I have this huge archival resource, I can talk about almost anything. Today I talked about the lawyers, but if you need me in the future, you call me.
Thank you. And
I can't talk about anything I know. I can just talk what people told me.
Are you open to, if our attendees have any questions, I can forward those to you after the program as well?
Oh, sure. Of course.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So I have our 2 upcoming programs here on the screen. Everyone who's attended and who's registered will receive a follow-up email, I believe tomorrow, with a link to a feedback survey so we can get your comments about tonight's programs, and I'll share that with Jane as well. And in that, you can also join our online mailing list if you're not already a part of that, so you can be notified of when registration opens for these 2 programs. And finally, I just want to say the Judiciary History Center depends so greatly on donations from our supporters to provide free public programming, which we're doing with Jane's program and her generous time, in addition to stewarding our collection of historic artifacts and archives, maintaining our exhibits, offering other educational services to our community. And in the feedback survey, there will be a link to donate to our nonprofit if you are feeling generous and have the capacity. And we are so, so grateful for that. And I just want to say again, thank you for being here to support our programs tonight and to interact with Jane. It looks like we are at time. Yes.
May I add, Brianna, this is a gem of a little museum and it is worth
Thank
preserving.
you
So
so
if
much.
anybody feels generous and wants to give, this would be a very worthy place to give.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And thank you to our participants who joined us. We are wrapping up the program. So I just want to say mahalo and malamopono, take care, be safe, and we'll see you again.
Aloha.
Thank you, Jane.
Bye.